How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Julian Gonzalez here. So, let's take a look now at creating this Wordle game, which is the web app is all about giving you is 6 attempts to figuring out is a 5 long letter word. And it might sound silly game, but it's also involved is all of the little details that is lost in the translation, especially when somebody tells you is that, hey, I do want you to build this feature or to do this, so on and so forth, right? So it turns out that this particularly game, and also thanks to Josh Komewa to actually make this possible, because in his effort into this particular course that he made that about not only React but also is JavaScript and develop an intuition around this, okay, which is pretty much what I'm doing here, at least in today's video with React. There are several other courses out there and videos of me taking notes of the CSS for JavaScript developer, which is also a course from Josh Komewa. But in this case, it's from React, right? And not only to understand it, where React came from, how can we create our own React, what React is, and especially which is a thin little layer around any DOM element that you might find. And what was the problems that now people who made this, for example, Facebook, had, all right? And why now React actually come up with the solutions to that problem. And React not only has been shown that is a very effective way, at least to provide now much more interactivity to web applications like this, but also is in other platforms that you can run JavaScript. So not only on the web like this, but also is on the mobile that I also have experience with, which is using React Native. The export is certain directive that each one of them is targeting is specific UI elements in those specific mobile OS. So whether it's Android or iOS and Windows Phone, and also is the WebLG, right? The other environment where you can run is now JavaScript. So it turns out that as we get into understanding, creating on React, what React is all about, which is now a JSON that describes the current state of that UI, okay? And how can we now is create this React from scratch, how lengthy and verbose it is for us to do so, to say, hey, let's go to now make our life much more simple, because at the end of the day we are repeating ourselves too much. So instead of any time that we need to create an element, use a JavaScript library, let's go to now is use a syntax or a mini language, a language in itself, that combine now is what we need to do here. What is the thing that is recurring and tedious? So it is combining is JavaScript with HTML. All right, this is known as the GSX. So what GSX is, what is the goal of GSX, how can we look at this difference between GSX and HTML in terms of how you can write it a syntax, what is the attribute, how you can use the attributes, what is the syntax for, some of the elements that React provide, for example, like fragments, and also how you can now do things that are quite repetitive. Okay, so for example, is how do you now is render a collections of values. All right, I can make that here in the model one, as you can see here. So understanding is GSX. What is the new way of creating our UI elements as a component? What is a component? What are the anatomy of the component? What is the property that we get as a component? How a component looks like? What is the props and children's? How can we look at the application structure of this way of writing an application? For example, with React, okay, which is the entry point with the index file that is going to be used for loading this CSS and any other configuration that we might need to, and also is starting to load is this UI into the DOM. Then the app home, which is anything related to React, so for example like context and provider and stuff like that. Okay, and how now we organize our code here using now EX6 models. Okay, and then how we can iterate over data. So using now is the map or any of this array method that is provided thanks to JavaScript. What is the convenient way, or why is that GSX is so compelling rather than using, for example, is other frameworks out there like Vue or Angular or any other template engine that they have to define their own particularly syntax logic, for example, rendering elements or conditionally rendering elements, rendering a list of elements or conditionally rendering elements. But here with GSX, we don't have that because we're reusing is JavaScript. This is one of the main selling point of React, of using React in that sense. So as we look at how can we iterate through a collections of values, how can we render multiple components in that, how can we conditionally rendering elements, whether it's using the if or the double ampersand, like it works like an if statement here, or how you can use now is the ternary operator to conditionally use in the template with if and else. All right, and as we explore also how can we now add style to our components, especially in React, so there have been several methodologies out there to do so over the couple years, and the ecosystem has evolved around that. We have is the bend methodologies, the way of how you can describe is block elements and modifiers by giving its particular names to each one of them. But there's some problems around that as it is. And then we have is the CSS model, which is now using model bundlers like Webpack, which say, hey, I'm going to create now is this particularly given this CSS file that you're going to import into this ES model, the JavaScript file. Okay, so I'm going to create now is a particularly long and unique identifier as a selector that is made of the name of this component, some hash data, as well as the name of that selector, right? So this is known as the CSS model, and this is how you can now is referencing is selectors in the CSS, all right, into JavaScript code, which if you're trying to do that bare hand with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, is something that is quite tedious, lengthy, verbose, you know. Uh, and as I look at that, and also how to work with states, it's also important to understand now how to handle user inputs, or at least the introduction of the model 2, which is working with states. And that is, here we're gonna see is how to handle is events uh, without React and with React. Okay, how can we now is use a particular hook to keep track of an state change, what this state change is doing, aka the React use state loop, right? And what this state is doing, what is the series of steps that this rendering mechanism is doing, how is the name of this each one of those phases, which is the trigger, the rendering, and then the painting, or the triggering, the commit, the triggering, the trigger phase, the render, and the commit, and ultimately the painting. And how the painting, and what is the difference between rendering and painting here, especially in the React ecosystem. Okay, and then, well, now see how can we create is, or how can we work is, for example, and how now exactly how this use state hook or the core React loop works, how this is asynchronous, why this is asynchronous, and how to work with one of the most common and yet so tedious things to do in JavaScript, which is working with forms. All right. So how traditionally can we create our forms? How can we now handling is the input of those forms, and because there is no consistent way to collect data, there is no a pattern to binding the value and listen for an event change, because for example in the case of inputs, well, they behave quite similar. By listening is the change, the on change, but for example with select, or with text area, or with radio button, or checkboxes, or sliders, or range, they don't work the same as expected, right? So how now is React is encapsulating is these different impossible inputs into a particular way of how can we now update the value in that input, and then detect when that input change. All right, via the handling the change of that input on change, and the value that you want to attach to. So as we look at this, and especially when you're working with forms, since the way traditionally form was conceived even before fetch methods, or even XHSR HTTP requests, or even JSON, right? The way this form traditionally work is they're going to send now a request to the server via the action, right? With this data that you are sending over to. But because here we don't want that behavior, we want to prevent the behaviors. So that's why we, instead of letting that happen, we just only want is to prevent that behavior, prevent the default behavior here. So far so good, because this is how you can work with forms, and depend of the type of and depend of how you can work with your form, whether it is as an input, input control or not. And control is that React is taking control of these elements as it is, which is great. All right. So this might work for a small subset of elements that you might look at that. All right. But also, you can is now if the form is long enough, is rely is on the default behavior that form provides, right? So on submit, so instead of attaching a particular state for each one of those inputs, you're just going to on submit is creating now a form object using as a form data and get that input, right, by it is ID, and then now do the validations in the handlers before sending the data. So this is how can we traditionally work with forms, or this is how we can work with forms particularly, right? We also look at an example of working with forms. Also, how can we work with props and state, what props and state means, and dealing with complex states, aka working with objects. This is now going too deep into the JavaScript. So for example, is that how you handle is objects like arrays or objects or even function, but in our case just only objects and array, and how you can deal with it, and how to create a new state in order to avoid mutation bugs. So also we look at how can we now dynamically generate a key for those elements that is going to be rendered when you define this when you dynamically rendering it. When you dynamically define a list, when you're dynamically rendering a list of components, all right, and how, because React needs to keep track of each one of those elements, how the key is being used for that, how you can generate a new element for that, how crypto get random UUID is a way to get a value and assign that as an ID. And also is that how you can is giving a particular state, lift that up so it won't, so it can now is so it can now indicate is where this component is not, it can indicate this state at which part of your component 3 is going to be rendered, right? And understanding is the component instance and some of these state management tools like we have found so far, right? So whether it is React or whether it is a Redux or Sunstand, among others, but the point is to understand now what is the role of those state management, how can we use now context to do so, and then finally is getting into a detail of what a React is doing, what this project is all about, right? So for this game, all right, I look at this, which is what is the game that we're going to build, this Wordle, as I mentioned before. Okay, so you got now 6 attempts to figuring out a 5-character long word. So you can start is with hello here, diggy, and you can enter, and it's gonna tell you that hey, those that are great is not part of the word. Those that are orange, it is part of the word, but not in the position, and so on and so forth, right? And then you can start to figuring out more words. For example, like E, you can say draw, or ooh, that's interesting. Um, hmm. Uh, French. Well, or fried, right? Uh, uh, fro, fro, right? This is a name, so you can see what is the word in that, right? So yeah, and not only that, is getting into the detail of how you can build these applications. So here we are, right? And it all in order to understand that, first we look at how can we clone our projects, what is the local development step in order to do so, get ourselves familiar with the game in itself, all right, um, which is the folder structure of the way of how can we create our programs or our applications here, as we can see here or here, right? And now a subtle but very peculiar. This is part of the details of how you can now create this application, all right? This Wordle, and that is how you started to organize is your component, whether it's by using it as an index or not. And this index is known as the barrel file. So the TLDR is that since the web server traditionally use an index as a way to send, it use an index.html as a way to send that to the browser, and now it render and show the content to the user. So the point here is that by using is the index in this project folder structure is a way to export only the components and any other file that are relevant for this view or these components, whether it is constant that you might define for these applications, or utility functions, or even hook, because now we are in the React web development here. All of them we're gonna live in this folder. There are some suggestions that you should get rid of the index.js for that, and just rely purely is on the app.js as it is. Again, the discussion is because there is a lot of project out there is using is index.js, and the problem is that the more file you are having per component that have an index, the longer it take for the bundler, which is the responsible for spin up the local def and show you the proper UI in def, and also is when it comes to build that in production, link all of those components as well and build or linking all of this different, so linking the dependency model or the graph model, so linking then, flattening into one single file or perhaps multiple files, and then merge that, right? So they can now be ready to deliver to the client. The TLDR of this is that the more file you have here, the more it will take for that model bundler, which is helpful for development, to spin up a dev server and provide you hot model reload features. So for example, anytime you make a change, you can see is those changes on the browser. All right. So you don't have to do that. So you don't have to press F or reload command R every time. This is for the development, and the bundle also offer a, for production is bundle up the application that is being ready to be delivered in the most lightweight possible by linking all of these different files, concatenate and stringify. So it's going to concatenate all of this file and then minify that. So putting all of this together, so now there can be ready for the deployment. So it's ready to be delivered. So I do find this is quite interesting, because if you remove is this index.js, not only for running your local dev environment is you save quite amount of time, but also for your test and when it comes to build your application. That's the whole argument here against index or not. But I do find that this is something that is being said by a couple people. All right, file on the React, right? So you can find is all of this on the React. He actually is using is Next exclusively here, right? He's using now Next exclusively for that. Next 15 snappy UI optimized with use the for value and diggy all of the things here, right? And you can look at this for different categories: CSS, React, animation, JavaScript, career. Start on business, internships, transition from adjacent field, referrals in community, side project, and freelancing, personality and skill set. Interesting. That is mind bending. Started a company and hired myself. Nobody else will hire a 20 years old chef who left school at 16. Holy moly. That is mind bending, bro. Mm-hmm. Holy crap. Mm-hmm. So he stopped to, well, 2024. Okay. And that's interesting. If you can join them, beat them. 7% of respondents got the starve by employing themselves. This is a clever idea that honest never even occurred to me. You get 100% valid work experience, and you are under no obligation to tell future employees that you were your own boss. If you struggle to get traction through other avenues, this might be an idea worth pursuing if your situation allows for it. Mm-hmm. among self-taught folks, though only 4% got their start this way. That's interesting. Only 4% started this way, started their own business, transition from adjacent fields, referral and community, and side project and freelancing. Hmm. Hmm. Referrals and community involvement. Okay. Okay, that's quite interesting. That kind of a story here. Letting the engineering teams behind checkout and account UI extension and functions in Montreal, Canada. That's interesting. Had a music app for Facebook. I have degree in neuroscience. Self-taught myself programming. First Java, then PHP. Build WordPress plugin to show off my skill. It worked. First did freelancing. Now full-time remote. Work plus 3 years. Mm-hmm. That's another one. Principal software architecture in Aleco. Focus on WordPress and PHP. Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. Holy moly! I built a Game Boy Advance emulator using Rust and WebAssembly. Holy hell! But I don't know why. Mm. I have a college degree, but not related to software engineering. I have photojournalism degree. Graduate with a non-CS degree into a recession with no idea what I want to do. Realized my computer skills were worth more on the market than most entry-level job. So I started freelancing. One of the clients hired me full-time, being in this space ever since. Mm-hmm. UX engineering on material design research. Okay, that is interesting. And personality. Pick a strategy that work for you. Um but in any case, I do think this is also part of. This might be quite interesting, and it's also revealing. Another thing that I look is how it's revealing the number of hits this page is getting to. 75 hits. That's a lot, man. From a website that started 20 to 5 years ago. And here. Mm-hmm. And all of his talks, you know.
If we had more charm in it. 2D spin along its z-axis. Is it not there? Oh, no, there it is.
So in any case, what I did here, okay, by recapping is this whole story on how do we get here, is because now that we know how do we get here, finally let's do what we need to do, which is building this particular war game. So let's get into this. Let me actually is do we have is no, but this is the new component. This is the local development. This is the project that I do want is to um, do here, right? The project Wordly. All right. Okay. Um. So yeah, there you got it. Project Wordly. Diki diki diki. Oh, to create a pull request for that. Hmm. Okay. Okay. Diki diki. I don't think I create that fork. Okay, no problem. No problem. Good. Diggy diggy. Let's continue to do this. And I do want to open up with cursor. Cursor is already running. If I click here, we already even have is the local icon here, right? So there you go. So there's a couple of things that's going on here. First is that we limit our inputs to only be maximum to a particular gap. All right, sort of speaking. Let me is indeed here the way how it creates that is by a particular script called component. Components dependency called new component, and say new component, say npm mm-hmm. Oh my god, the hell. Hello. Mm. Mm-hmm. It's taking too much time. It's taking way too much time. Here we open it. What about now? It's taking an unusual amount of time. Okay, close and reopen it. Mm. Why is it taking so long? Does it get corrupted? So close. Open up cursor again. Or VXCO, whatever. Oh my god, for real? Mm-hmm. Wow, what the French still happened to you, cursor? Hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Anyway. Anyway. I don't know what's going on with cursor. Yeah, what the French toast happened with cursor, man? Holy moly. Okay. Well, you know what? Let me do something very straightforward. It's time. It's time. Open at the Finder. Go to Application and remove cursor, bro. Take care. Bye bye. All right. There you go. Mm-mm-mm. Let me download cursor again. Right. It identify this, but I am not sure. So it seems that this is the latest version 2.0. If I open up now cursor again, Please be my guest. And there you go. Alright. Project Wordle. What the French stuff is this? Mm-hmm. Okay. Ike is this one. So, because here, hello, no, it's dead, is dead. Okay, no problem. Open up that again. Because here is npm run component, and the name of the component will be called is search input. It say, hey, there is no script called component. So what is the name of this? It's new component. You can say, hey, new component search input, right? It create now this as it is under that file. Okay? Under that file. So we can get rid of this. So right now you're not looking at what I did, but if I show you, is this. Let me do this much more intuitive. What it is. Let me go and check the cursor here. Okay, so what I did is this. I already created this component, right? And this is the particular input. So, but because the discussion before getting into this, it was more about, hey, how can we now organize our component and where to organize it? Pretty much like how to organize the component here, okay? And it turns out that if you're starting with a particular application, whether it's a React application from scratch, it turns out that defining is the name of the component and then an index. This is how the web servers have traditionally worked. Okay, by now, defining is an index.html that when the user now navigate to that particular URL, is going to the server redirect that with a 304. It's going to redirect to that index and aka send that back to the browser. And the browser, through the critical rendering pass, is going to transform the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into pixels on the screen. So, because of that, all right. So because of that, here to create that component, and since it has several trade-offs, all right. So you can do something like this. Let me delete this for a moment and then create that, because that particular approach has several issues, especially for small applications or web applications. Perhaps having an index or aka a barrel like this file is not problematic, But if your application is, for example, serving 4 million customer, and you are now is a financial institutions or a Facebook or Google or any of this airline uh, that needs to send and have organized several components depending on the business use case. So you quickly realize that, hey, uh, because the way how you can, when it comes to developing your applications in this React way, you have now the development and the building, which is the production, right? So for development, uh, we have now a something called model bundler that is going to allow easy to speed up the feedback dev loop. In other words, so anytime that you make a change in any of these components, you're gonna see those reflected on the browser. So far, so good. This is for development, and this is managed by these model bundlers. One of the job that these model bundlers are doing, and the other is that because sending these huge files is not optimized, okay? Traditionally, the way how these model bundlers build your applications ready to be delivered is by taking this by minify this, right? And then if you have now more JavaScript file, it's going to concatenate, aka it's going to flat and merge them. So and once that is done, now your code, which is being transpiled into a browser safe JavaScript code, is ready to be delivered. And that building and developing times, and also is for the testing, the more index files you have, the more time it will take for the model bundler only to link all of those files to figuring out to create is the model graph before the code is even executed. So again, I'm using is this, all right? In this case, I'm using is this, exactly. So I'm using is this approach is only because now this is, if you're not using any framework, this is something that you might want to use with, all right? But if you somehow find yourself in the need of using a framework, you don't want to go with. And I actually compare that with, for example, Next.js and other application, and other frameworks that they actually is not using is index, aka in order to routing all of those components, they're using now a specific folder structure to do so. So, but in any case, here we got, right? So I do want to remove this content, which is something that I did define here, and voila, right? We already have is our state as it is. So the key thing that I want to brought here is that in this case, we define is now in a state because the spec demands that this is a control form, and this control form must satisfy certain conditions, which is, hey, the mean value and the max value must be 5, all right, and a particular pattern, and when that pattern follows or when the pattern is not, we're going to rely is on HTML validations, right? So far so good, right? And when it comes to handle that, so when the user now click on submit, and when they hit enter in this form, well, we're going to collect that data, first prevent the default behaviors, validate that, and then now set that as it is. So, so far so good, right? So we actually get that. There's no issue with this. We can create this our commit here with a message to say, um, so first commit, or you can say is exercise one input, right? So, or search input component. Okay. Another thing that I want to bring this up is that because I know what is the roadmap, it turns out that anytime that you find yourself dealing with this kind of problems in computing all these series of steps, uh, a good process is defining the inputs, defining the outputs, aka defining is what is going to receive, what you want to, what is the result, the output. Define some middle, or define some naive approach to the problem, all right, and then figuring out the trade-off of your decisions. So see where you can now improve your code. And I do find that that particular process is, and then in the middle of your algorithm or your solution here, you find yourself with the new problems, or problems that cannot be break down into multiple small simple tasks. All right, again, define the inputs, define the outputs, and then define a sub algorithm, and so on and so forth, right? Until you get the final desired outcome. That's actually worked for me pretty well with another over the past years, and I do think this might work well for spec-driven development, where the idea is that you will have is certain requirements, business requirements. It is important to define the inputs and the outputs, and in the middle, defining the series of steps to do so, right? Uh, Particularly, you might find helpful use AI to do so, okay? Or somebody that has more experience in that project. But yes, that's what it is. Good. We can now push this. Push origin, origin main, right? And it say, hey, error permission joy denied to you there you got it. Because oh my god, did I push that? Ooh, oh hello. Ooh, okay, I didn't bring this up. Git switch, or git check, git reset. Do I have the name of the commit? Yes, I do have. Is this one? Okay, so git reset to this. Do a hard. Exactly. So now head is there. I do want is to not apply by setting is git. Okay. In fact, let me create now a fork for this. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Now I do want is to create this. Mm-hmm. So git remote git set git remote set URL to this. Oh, I get it. I get it. Git remote get URL origin. You're right. Origin. That's right. But this is now the new URL as it is. Git remote get URL origin. But if I do want to replace that, git remote set URL, git remote origin set URL to this, right? It's a unknown command, git remote git remote remove the name of the origin here, and then I can say is git add remote git remote add with the name of that and the URL, which is not this, is in fact is this. Is this one. Right? And now what I can do is to say git status git pull from origin the main branch is up to date. It actually creates two mains here, right? And then now apply this change as it is, and those changes it means well, actually I do have them. Git status in this case, exactly git add all of them. All right, and in our index you say I put the game here, right? I do want to add the search input here as it is. Just like that. Of course this is not going to work because it requires you to add me is a fragment, so this will avoid polluting that. And it is this one. So search input needs to be imported from that component as it is. Another thing that I would like to is to use is the aliases, like this. So when to use now the aliases is just a way to know where is the source of these projects. Okay, so if I run now this project here and say npm run def, right, you say take it this, take it. It say, hey, I couldn't recognize that because perhaps on the model bundler you may not have them. Yeah, on the model bundler you don't have them. Okay, so on the model bundler you don't have them. In fact, you're running is parcel and say public index HTML. Okay, what is going to be low all of this. And everything is now loading is the index as it is as a model here. But all of this is on development. All right, so that's right. That's right. So it seems that here we don't have any access to this, and we must rely is on this absolute URL as it is, because we don't have any layer that is taking care of the despite we don't have any configuration from parcel, right? We don't have any configuration from parcel. That's what it is. So if we had that, well, we can actually tweak that, but I don't want to get lost into the detail, not in this kind of detail. No. Are you there? There you got it. All right. So if we now go back to here the game, we can now see this search input, look up the game, which is the game, and remove this as it is, and just print that as like that. Right, just search input as it is. So yeah, and that works. That actually worked as expected. So you can create a new one. Okay, which is here. So you can create is a new one. So git status is this. We modify that. There you got it. So git add everything. Git add everything to that. It's going to create now a commit. Let's say, hey, search input component, and there you got it. So when we push this chain, I can say origin to main, and that'll be sent to that remote desktop as it is. Because search input component, because I might prefers to create a branch of that. Okay, I would like to create now a branch of that, but in any case it doesn't matter, not for this case. Okay, so now the next is well, define is the output, how this is gonna look like, right? And by this, how it's gonna look like is that when you type here, how you gonna show these elements into the DOM. So for example, like this. Oh, really? Well, okay. Let me show Brave here. This one. Okay. So how can we now show is anytime that you input there, that, right? How are you going to add that to the DOM? So anytime that you do so. So we need to define is the basic structure, HTML structure, that is going to be appended there, all right? So aka we can is render is a collections to that, all right? And of course initially it won't have anything, and then as we type here and that satisfy the condition, we're going to now append that word next to each other. Okay, so the criteria is there is no need to create a new component here, or here they do. It's a hey, a new component should be created to render previous guesses. When the user submit their guess, that value should be rendered with the new component, and there should not be key warning in the console. So because this is the structure, okay, as a way to now render on top of that here. So let's create now is a silly example here, and that silly example will be is first defining here. So I do want is to now is render here. So the input will be is the input will be is this word, and the output is render that as in a stack. All right, that's what we want to do. So let's get into this. Here we're going to define is a new div here. All right, and this will have now a different div here, where you say is so first guess, right, and then the second guess, and so on, right? So second guess and first guess, all right, things like this. So I do think no, it won't render that. So if I wrap this into a fragment to render all of its elements as it is, diggy, okay. To render all of its elements as it is, and when I do this, I get these elements here. So what I want to do is just to append those elements next to each other as it is, right? Anytime I add a new element to that, so you get the idea, right? So how can we do that? Well, we can define is now is a collection, right, as a particular state of guesses. That's right. And render that collections of guesses here. So I do want is to render that collection of guesses here. So by iterating it through all of his guesses and map each one of them. So by the time I get a guess, okay, I do want is to now render this guess.id. So right now we don't have any ID, okay, and you have is a guess, guess.name, for example, right? And there you go. the hell you did? And why you removing all of the other elements? Diggy diggy. You get this, and is this one. Let me close this as it is. And there you got it. Exactly. So, so by the time that we now handle the search input, not only that we're going to verify is that element is in there, but also is to attach that, right? So here now set guesses, all right, will be now a new state that I would like to create here to say is the new guess, all right. That'll be now an object with the ID of using crypto.random UUID rather than math.random, because now this actually guarantee is a it guarantee you a probabilistic it guarantee you a truly random number, unlike math.random. It's because those algorithms generate is those random numbers, right? So crypto.random now follows an algorithm that is very likely or is astronomically less likely to generate now random numbers anytime you call it. Okay, so this is it, all right, and the other is now the name, which is well, the guess, or you can only just call that as guess, right, to make it much more straightforward. So this will be now is the guess, right? I can define this as a cons and define this down the row here, all right? So by the time that we create these objects, I want is to now is get whatever we have on the guesses, all right. You say new guess, you can say is get whatever you have. This is new guesses, all right. Get whatever you have on the guesses objects, all right. And I do want is to create now is a new element, so iterate through all of these elements and put those elements into this new array. This is what this spread syntax is doing. Behind the scene is calling now an iterator that is calling is if this is a collection or if this identifier follow the iterator protocol, aka that this is now an iterable object, and this iterable object has implement now the iterator protocol, and if it is okay, so I know how to iterate through these collections, right? And then now put all of these new elements into this array, and then now add the new guess at the last. So once you do this, so set guesses is this, and you just only now assign the new guesses. This is also working with complete states. And yeah, you are going to pretty much look at that. Let's take a look at this. So you say hello. Please match the request format. 5-letter word is that. Oh, okay. Good, good. This is the HTML validations, and here it's telling me it's max length 5, min length 5. The pattern must be this. In 5-letter words. And it tells me here is this. Please match the request format. 5-letter words. Max length and min length. The pattern here, and they say max length word. It is required. So when I click there, all right, it gives me is that warning. Okay, so when it calls that, right, it's supposed to now render that guest ID with guest name, right, with guess.guess. One way we can do this is to do this, is to say, hey, let me stay the pattern there. Okay. And do this, and the structure is now what guess is here. So we have now the ID, and also is the guess as it is. So we can pass now the ID, the same for guess, and then you got it, right? Hello. You say, hey, I couldn't match that. That's might be quite silly of why it can allow me to do so. Especially with the pattern.
It doesn't come with its own validation library because it
AC and AC, in my case, it seems like it doesn't work as expected. Because I was using is now is other things. So if I do is hello, okay, now it works as properly. So hello, next, it wouldn't allow me to do that. Say, hey, call, no, and you get the idea. So this actually works, right? But we define is this instead of this component. Let's going to create now is indeed is another component that is responsible for this particular state, right? It's gonna call this guess list, sort of speaking. All right, guest list again. npm run component, which is guess list, right? Guess list. npn is because it is called new component. It is called new component, guess list, and you got it. So now the new component and get list is there. Guess list. This is the HTML. All right. So this is the HTML. And here we are going to define is now couple of stuff here. So here we're going to receive is the guesses, all right, guesses, and also is the handler on or the set guesses, right? So we have now our state defined here, and because anytime that state change, we don't want to re-render that element, right? We don't want to remember. Okay, this is a good segue here, because okay, this is a great segue here. Why is that? This is a great segue here, because here in these components, what I want to do is that only render this is when we accept that right? In other words, it'll be something like this. So but this is being controlled by here, right? So in other words, here we're going to now is render the guess list, all right, followed by the guesses. And if we pass now the guesses as it is, okay, if we pass now the guesses or the guess list component, right, we want is to now render that element when these components change, aka when there is a state change of this component. So it turns out that not only when we set the guess and the guess list, all right, we are unfortunately are going to render all of these elements here. But also is, so for example, anytime that these elements change, all right, it will also render or call all of the elements down the road, all of the component elements here. So for our case, right, it might not be quite relevant here, right, because this will work as expected. So if we inspect now is here, and we say hello, it will work as expected. But the caveat here is that how you use this. The caveat is that how and when you use this. But who the French does? Exactly. How you gonna do this? Because anytime that you are now typing here, all right. So anytime that you are typing here, we already have that. We are actually rendering is all of these components here, right? We are actually going to render all of the nested components here. So one way to solve this is to say, hey, well, I can wrap this into an use memo function by saying, hey, use memo function. That is something that is provided by that. Okay. You can call it like this and use now React Memo. Okay. And then something here. So, but it turns out that now it's still calling it, right? The spy that I am not is rendering that. So this component is still getting rendering here. The spy I am not, I don't want to do that. All right. You know, so the spy that I am not want to do so. And it turns out that so for example is this. Right? So for our case, it might work as expected. But unfortunately, now anytime that we are now is updating this component here, is going to also now is rendering all of the nested components that live inside of this in this component, right? So how can we prevent that behavior? Okay. Well, let me see what is the solution here if he already have that. So the thing here is that it has this get result as a collection here, class name guess result, and the other is the guess as a class name call guess. As it is. And there you got it, right? Good, good. Okay. And the other is the get slot. In the real world game, the initial screen shows 6 row and 5 square. Alright. But this is quite interesting because this actually doesn't work as expected. Because it's going to continue to call that as it is, right? But it said guess did not render. Alright. Guest list did not render. And it only render that. But again, premature optimizations can be the root of all evils. Okay? Premature optimizations can be the root of all evils. Because if this component now have more nested components that needs to be rendered when something change, well, then you have now a problem. So in any case, if we remove the React memo here and just export this guest list, right? We remove this, we keep track of this, hello, there, right? And as you can see here, every time now this component is of course getting rendered. Right? This component now is getting rendered. So the TLDR of all of this is that put your states further down the tree to be now only then affect that area, all right? As well as the memo. So the memo must live is on the leaf components. All right. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.